I'm an economic historian, and I did correctly anticipate this, that I would be the only one emphasizing the importance of the regional dimension of the race issue. And that's what I'm going to speak to at the moment. Now, I have been pushing this position for quite a long time with almost no success whatsoever. So I'm going to change my approach a little bit and appeal to authority. My authority is Charles Blow, the New York Times columnist. And as you can read, he wrote, this is a comment on the primaries then going on, there isn't one black America but two, the children of the Great Migration and the children of those who stayed behind in the South. Having spent the first half of my life in the South and the second in Great Migration destination cities, I can attest that the sensibilities are as different as night and day. I appreciate that because he can speak with authority, far more authority than I. And I won't try to speak about that particular dimension, black sensibilities, but I will try to speak about the continued relevance of the racial dimension. So here's a summary of what I'm going to have to say. Number one, economic analysis of race must be historical. I was pretty sure many people would say things somewhat resembling that. But I will go on to argue that racial economic structures differed between the North and South prior to the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Explicit segregation supported a racial wage gap in the South, whereas in Northern black, unemployment was persistently higher for blacks. And here's a striking fact that has not been mentioned, and it seems to me it should be mentioned in any discussion of race and economics in America. Black occupational progress since, it should be 1980, but anyway, it's not since the Civil Rights Act, but since 1980 has been mainly in the South, especially since 1980, especially white-collar employment. And we have a phenomenon of ongoing post-Civil Rights Act black migration into the South. So I argue that economic analysis of race in the USA must also be regional. I'll try to move quickly. I probably can't get through all my slides, but I think I can get my main message through. There was a racial wage gap in the South, but I argue that it emerged historically over time. It's an application of what I refer to as the Arrow-Schwab equilibrium wage gap model, in which you have vertical job segregation, unequal education is both cause and effect, and it was maintained by prejudice, expectations, and out-migration. The Civil Rights Act, Title VII in particular, broke down segregation barriers, changed incentives, and opportunities for education. Here's one table. A series of interesting studies. It is not easy to find racial wage data in American economic history. But here's a series of studies, but it's one about entry-level wage gaps north and south in 1937. And what you can see is there was virtually no racial wage gap in the North. There was a very large racial wage gap in the South, 25% overall, and 50% if you look at segregated firms. Two different systems. Which one was better? Which one was worse? Which one was more discriminatory? I think we make a mistake in buying into that metric. The classic economics of discrimination from Gary Becker would lead people to look for a coefficient. Which one was more discriminatory? I think it's better to say they were two different systems. In the South, it was know your place. In the North, it was not clear that there really was a place for black workers, except that periodically there were times of excess demand which encouraged black migration. Well, okay, what was this classic Arrow-Schwab model to the economists? It's a case where you get feedback from the labor market to schooling. An interesting case in point was the Rosenwald Fund. Their expert visited the South in the 1930s. He wanted to do something for black schools as well as white schools. So they did a survey trying to understand what kinds of courses in the black high schools would be useful for black employment. And they found that there were no occupations for which a high school education would be useful for black students. And you get this classic rationalization. If commercial courses were offered in the Negro school, there would no doubt be tremendous pressure to get into them, and the only result would be keen disappointment to almost everyone. I mean, getting a job as a secretary or stenographer was one of the main things you could do with a high school education in those days, but black women were excluded. Why were they excluded? Well, the rationalization was they wouldn't be accepted in those jobs anyway, so why train them for it? And then I tell the story of James Field, applying for a job at Union Bag in Savannah, 1940s. When I filled out my application, I put grade 9 instead of 12th because I figured that they didn't want no smart black man. I was hired. And there's a case where he did get the education, but he understood that at least in the South, it was better not to indicate that you had as much as a 12th grade education. Okay, I've heard a number of statements about how black unemployment has always been about twice as high as white unemployment. And what I say to that and many other statements that have been made, yes, but not in the South. In the North, you get that high black line. This is from an article by Jenny Bourne, what she calls VRA, that's Voting Rights Act states. So she's really talking about the South, much higher in the South than in the North. So which is better, which is worse? I think we should analyze how these systems worked and not try to say which is better or worse because they have very different properties and very different changeabilities. Now, I did take part in a research project that had something to do with Detroit, and that was a study of the records of the Ford Motor Company, mainly in the 30s. And what you find is that Ford dominated the hiring of black labor in the Detroit area. And Ford followed a policy of no racial wage differential. What they got by paying blacks the same wages, despite the stereotypes about black labor being low quality and high turnover, was very stable black labor force. Because married black workers, and they got preference in hiring by Ford, the pay was so much better than any outside alternative that, of course, they clung to those jobs as long as they could. Whereas for white workers, there were many other options and their turnover rates were higher. So that, in essence, is how I see this structure in the pre-civil rights days. What happened with the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was, in the South, you got dramatic changes in the racial integration of particular industries in the South. Most dramatic was the textiles industry, which is a low-wage, considered an unskilled industry, and yet it had been lily white for 100 years. And it changed almost overnight in 1964. And despite the fact that this was clearly in the self-interest of the employers, they had to be pushed to do it. They resisted. They snubbed the hearings of the EEOC. But once pushed into it, they bought into it, and bought into the new ideology, and within a few years, they were preaching this new gospel of interracial tolerance and cooperation. Now, I want to make one point of correction to statements that have been made many times at this conference. This was not a matter of overthrowing racial segregation laws. The labor market was almost completely unregulated by law in the South. When you say that the Civil Rights Act was easy for the South because it overthrew de jure segregation, you're buying into the perspective of mainstream economics, which tends to explain away the achievements of the Civil Rights Act in the South because they say, well, of course that was inefficient because it was imposed by law. It was not, and the same is true of the sit-in movement. They did not abolish segregation laws requiring segregation. What the public accommodations section of the Act overthrew was the right of a private proprietor to exclude customers on the basis of race. So by the time that issue hit the fan in the 60s, that was not a matter of de jure segregation either. Textiles was somewhat exceptional. Other industries took a lot longer and it involved a lot more litigation, but it did happen. These graphs come from South Carolina because South Carolina has taken has the best evidence on employment by race by industry. Now, what economists are inclined to do as a way of measuring the degree of discrimination is to estimate a wage regression, in which you put in a wage, and you put in a list of individual attributes, age, education, sex, race, and you say discrimination is that coefficient on race, which is the residual after you've put in everything else that might explain the racial wage differential. I don't think that's a good approach, given a labor market structure such as the one I've described. The reason is there was a complementarity between educational gains and occupational advances in the South. I mentioned that there was feedback from the labor market to schooling. Black high schools did not offer courses in auto mechanics, machine shop, television, so on, the rising new professions of the time. Once the employment opportunities opened up, the structure of the courses in the high schools changed. So you got rapid gains in black occupational attainment, and you got, that last bullet item mentions, an upsurge in recruitment visits to historically black colleges, mainly in the South, from 4 per school to over 300. Of course, they were coming from all over the country, but they had to come south because that's where the historically black schools were. Okay, the next few slides are going to document my claim that most occupational progress under the Civil Rights Act has occurred in the South. Here are black employment shares by region, 1966 to 2010, using EEOC data. And what you see is there were gains in both North and South, at least at first. But the biggest gains were in the South, movement of blacks into blue collar. That's a combination of skilled trades and operative jobs, and particularly into white collar jobs from which they had been excluded. The South starts out way behind on this graph, the red bar there, but by the end of the period, it's way in the lead. Some gains in the North, they pretty much came to an end after the Ronald Reagan setback of 1980. This next table I won't linger on very much. Is just showing you that if you distrust the EEOC data, and you should be skeptical because those are very large firms only, and the composition changed over time. But if you use census data for 1960, 1980, 2010, you get the same result. That's what I refer to as the Great Fork of 1981-83. You had very strong federal enforcement in the 1970s, despite Nixon's Southern strategy. The bureaucracy that had been set up and the support of the courts, you got continuing progress. But after Reagan, you got sharp cutbacks in almost every dimension of enforcement and affirmative action. Did the policy change weaken the employment effect? Yes. A lot of studies show a weakening of effectiveness, but not in the South. Some sense the South had attained exit velocity, so that even after the federal government heavy-duty pressure had moved away, you got continued progress. The next few graphs I'm going to go through pretty quickly because they all illustrate the points. Yes, a lot of it has to do with the fact that there are larger numbers, larger population shares in the South, but even if you normalize for that, the regional difference is very striking. There's blue collar, there's white collar, there's white collar MSAs, and I think one more which compares different regions. Look at this graph depicting black median income by region. At the start, the South is way behind. That is to say, black Southerners were way behind. You observe between 1950 and 1960, the Southern economy was growing rapidly, but blacks were not sharing in that growth. That's why I entitled the book Sharing the Prize. Once the reforms of the Civil Rights Act were enacted, and it predates it only by a year or two, and I consider it all a part of civil rights pressure, blacks began to share in those gains. Now, if I were to end the whole story in the year 2000, it would be a happy ending. Unfortunately, after 2000, everybody struggles. But it still remains true that the South is no longer the low-income region for African Americans. And here's the most striking graph that I have for you. Black migration into the South. You can see the great migration out of the South, and people still talk of that as the defining events. But since the 1970s, and I consider this a direct result of the Civil Rights Act, we've had black migration into the South. And what is truly remarkable is it has continued even through the Great Recession, and even through the consolidation of political power in now all the southern states by conservative Republican majorities that are virtually all white and don't even try to compete for the black vote. So why does it happen? Well, despite the fact that I've been studying it a long time, I don't really have an answer, but here's a list of candidates, all of which I think play a role. You can look at surveys, and many black migrants to the South refer to family and cultural roots. Political representation, despite the setbacks for the Voting Rights Act, you still have black political leadership and black political representation far higher in the South than anywhere else. And that has an economic impact as well. So you have business opportunities for black entrepreneurs in the South. I think there are home ownership opportunities that are better in the South, both because of property values, but also because of greater access to less segregated areas. Some of this I'm less sure of than others, but I'm reasonably confident about that. In a word, you say there are viable black communities in the South. Surveys indicate that 13 out of 15 of cities rated as best for African Americans are in the South. So you have job opportunities with education. It's a reversal of the selectivity that occurred in the first Black Great Migration because most of these people have college education and they're moving into management jobs. The next table is kind of hard to read, but it's showing you some survey evidence indicating the prominence of non-economic answers to questions about why people move. But as an economist, I think it's always a combination of economic and non-economic, but I think the social dimensions and the return to the roots are very important. Here's one more slide that refers to a major study of large retail firms where they at least claim that you got relatively random shifts in the racial identity of the hiring officers. And the finding of it was that black managers tend to hire more blacks than non-black managers and vice versa, especially so in the South. So it's an effect that you find everywhere, but there is a southern regional dimension to this black employment accomplishment. The most likely channels are you have relative segregation in hiring networks. How do you hear about jobs? You hear about it from your friends and acquaintances. That you have an applicant preference for a same race manager. And there's evidence that the job performance is actually better in those cases, as indicated by the duration of the. I think that's a good place for me to stop because I have only 5 seconds left. I think the bottom line is we should not abide by this convention of ruling race out of the ruling region out of the discussion of race. It's important historically, everyone agrees. I argue it's still important. I don't give advice to Detroiters that they should move south and find happiness, but I do say that maybe Detroit and other northern cities can learn something from what has happened under conditions of extreme political adversity within the South.